coming out absolutely clearly that the British government must break from this policy. That the British government should not allow Diego Garcia, which was ethnically cleansed by Harold Wilson's government in the 1960s, of its inhabitants in order to provide a base for the United States of America, that should not be used in any attack, that the British Navy should play no part whatsoever, that we should be warning about the dangers of this war, and that we should be seeing that the threats against Syria form part of a continuum with that war, an attempt to break any alliance of states and movements, which include, of course, Hezbollah in Lebanon, that are acting against and outside US interests at a time when the mass of the Arab people are awakening and taking political action. So we have big obligations here in Britain. We can't approach the Arab Spring and the situation in the Middle East simply as analysts or commentators or spectators. Britain has a long and almost entirely criminal history in the region, of which Cameron and Haig are, I'm afraid, the proud inheritors. That we must not allow ourselves to be diverted by, if you like, backing a regime or opposing a regime, endorsing this movement or criticising that movement in the Middle East, to blow us off our course, which is to unite the broadest numbers of people against intervention, an intervention that starts with diplomacy and interference politically, escalates through covert intelligence and military action, passes through phases like blowing up Iranian scientists in their cars, and ends up with direct military assault. We have more than enough evidence from the last 10 years as to the disaster this brings, not just for the peoples of the countries in the region concerned, but for the peoples of the entire world. And my message to everyone here today is that as we assess those events, let's not let any arguments or differences of assessment undermine our unity of purpose in opposing imperialism and war. Thank you.
Start with my thanks too to the Respect Foundation for organising this very important discussion. I think that the context in which the US and its allies are operating in the Middle East has changed, but not its goals. We've seen the Arab Spring and the events which Andrew has been touching on. We've seen the loss of the United States chief ally Mubarak in Egypt. We've seen, of course, the unfolding global crisis, which impacts on the capacity of the US to operate internationally. But nevertheless, in spite of those developments, I would take the view that the goals of the United States and its allies have not changed. In fact, I would go so far as to say that its key goal over many decades, which is, of course, the securing of oil, has only increased in significance over the last few years. And if you look at the statistics for the US oil imports, US oil import dependency has massively increased year by year. So the idea that they would lose interest in what remains, Gulf fossil fuel resources remain the chief fossil fuel providers globally, and that makes the region of increasing geopolitical significance, not less. And the US interest in that region is not lessened by political change and instability, it is only increased. Now, Andrew has spoken about the history of US-UK intervention in the Middle East over the decades, of course, specific episodes in the 1960s, regime change in Iraq, Iran, and so on, over the question of oil nationalisation. We know the history of our own country and other Western powers in the region, but I think that their interest and determination to control those resources is no less resolute today than it was in the 1950s or 1960s. Now, of course, the Arab revolutions, I would say, have presented both opportunities and threats to Western interests in the region. As I said, we've seen the loss of the US's chief ally, Mubarak. We've also seen some change in Egypt's attitude towards Palestine. I think the day when the Rafah crossing was opened was a momentous occasion. But those positive developments very rapidly gave way to Western intervention in Libya to attempt to redress the balance of what they were losing in that part of the world. And as a byproduct, of course, we've seen the attempts to rehabilitate so-called humanitarian intervention, although, of course, all the news that we hear coming out of Libya shows that Libya is facing humanitarian disaster as a result of that Western intervention. Now, under the circumstances of these political changes, we've seen an escalation of demand from the political right in the United States to knock out a potentially nuclear-armed Iran. And if you read the kind of articles that Andrew was referring to, of which there are very, very many in the US press, and what passes for more intellectual sort of academic publications and so on. Nevertheless, the idea of what they would describe as a rogue state Iran, armed with nuclear weapons, which of course they would describe for themselves as a deterrent. Obviously, they don't see that Iran has that same kind of right to a deterrent. They will consider that to be totally unacceptable because it would limit US capacity to act in the region. It would limit US political and resource options in the region. And of course, a nuclear-armed Iran would also upset the balance with the United States' chief ally in the region, that's to say Israel, which of course we should never forget is actually the only nuclear state in the Middle East, never mind a hypothetically nuclear-armed Iran. Israel already has a quite substantial nuclear arsenal, probably bigger than Britain's own nuclear arsenal. Now, I'm sure you recall that during the Bush years there was a lot of discussion about attacking Iran, particularly after the attack and invasion of Iraq and the accusations of Iranian interference in Iraq. That dropped away a little bit, I think, after the 2006 failure of the Israeli attacks on the Lebanon. So there was a sort of cooling off. And in the early Obama years as well, there was more of a focus on the diplomatic option towards Iran. But of course, their goal then remained the same, to prevent Iran having enrichment facilities. So that didn't go anywhere. But nevertheless, Obama had pursued a diplomatic rather than a military option against Iran. But that, of course, has now shifted back. And of course, we're seeing the sanctions and the possibility of potential strike against Iran. So what's the likelihood of an attack on Iran? What are the prospects for that, and what form could that take? Obviously, the possibility of this being spearheaded by an Israeli attack is a significant possibility. Israel doesn't want to lose its nuclear monopoly, that's absolutely clear. And of course, it's got a track record on striking preemptive strikes, so to say, on nuclear or supposed nuclear facilities. You may remember in 1981 the attack on the Osirak reactor near Baghdad, and of course in 2007 the attack on the Syrian facilities, which were supposed to have been nuclear facilities. Since then, there have been some new developments which make Israeli attack on Iran perhaps more likely. Previously, the Iranian nuclear facilities were more or less out of Israeli range, just sort of on the edge of the Israeli range. That has now changed because Israel has deployed new long-range strike aircraft, and they've also bought a large number of earth penetrator bombs from the United States, which would be suitable for dealing with bunker-type facilities. Israel also has close relations and military connections with Azerbaijan on the northern border of Iran, and also with the Kurdish northeast of Iraq, which is close to the Iranian border. So there's a possibility that if they were undertaking attacks, they could deploy here in the event of a conflict with Iran. We've also seen a strengthening of relationships between US and Israeli militaries following their cooperation around the Iraq war and occupation. So, for example, US foreign military assistance is a fifth of Israel's total annual military budget. So that's a very substantial economic investment, let's say, by the US in Israel's military. In addition to that, 2 years ago, the Pentagon allowed almost $1 billion of war reserves to be stored in Israel on the understanding that they would be available for use by Israel in the event of an emergency. Now, I don't know whether nuclear military strikes on Iran would be deemed an emergency, but large pool of resources there available. And also, of course, we've seen very much closer cooperation between the Israeli and US armies on things like equipment sharing and development. In particular, the Israeli army has helped the United States with counterinsurgency weaponry, so-called, which of course it has developed through its suppression and intervention in the Palestinian territories. So that's been a development as well. Those types of developments aren't much covered in the Western media, but of course they're very well known about in the Middle East. So there are very few illusions in the Middle East about that military relationship between Israel and the United States. And because of that close interrelationship, there is an assumption, which I think is absolutely correct, that any Israeli attack on Iran would be made on the basis not only of US knowledge, but also of US approval and assistance. And I think there is an assumption today also that additional US action would also take place. If there were Israeli strikes on specific nuclear facilities, there would also be additional US action that would go further than that, further than Israeli strikes, which would perhaps focus on the nuclear installations and the missile facilities. The US strikes would be intended to knock out any possibility of retaliation against the US and allied forces and facilities in the Middle East itself. So we've seen recent escalation, of course. Andrew's also touched on this. We've seen very recent sanctions by the United States and the EU on Iran, which I think could easily be described, and it's described by many people, as economic warfare. It's serious, very serious sanctions. We've seen again, as has been mentioned, the ships led by the US aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln in the Straits of Hormuz. We've seen the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, widely believed to have been perpetrated by the Israeli Secret Service. So we have this ratcheting up of tension and very strong possibility that attack will take place. Some people would go so far as to say that they would anticipate an Israeli strike on Iranian facilities within the next 2 to 3 months. We have no way of knowing, but that is a very real possibility that we, in the peace and anti-war movement in Britain, have to confront. But the reality is there is no evidence that Iran has developed nuclear weapons or has plans to do so. There's a great difference between the development of civilian nuclear power and nuclear capability. There's a big gap between that and the capacity or intention to develop nuclear weapons. I am, of course, absolutely opposed to nuclear proliferation by any country, and would oppose any country, including Iran, developing nuclear weapons. But the use of the Iranian nuclear program cynically and hypocritically by Western powers as an excuse to pursue regime change in Iran, as was pursued in Iraq under the same pretext, is absolutely reprehensible, and we must oppose it vigorously. There's no doubt that an attack on Iran would be the start of a protracted conflict which would not only bring disaster to the people of Iran but to the entire region, and it would increase, not reduce, the likelihood of nuclear weapons development and use in the Middle East. Thank you.